Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I am Josh, as always, and I am joined by Bo, also known as History Bro, or History Bo, for his background in history, believe it or not, which is going to be very useful today because we're going to be talking about the culture and politics of Russia. And what we're going to be doing in this part one is we're going to be talking specifically about the geography first, so you know what lands we're actually talking about, but also the history. And we're going to talk right back from the first idea of a kind of Russian state. It obviously wasn't called Russia then, but we're going to trace it through from the start of history to somewhat of the modern day, I suppose. So what I'm planning to do is start from the Middle Ages pretty much all the way to 1991, which is, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I'm going to pick up the politics side of things and that sort of thing in part two, where I talk about the culture, politics and economy of Russia. And I've split it into two parts for a very deliberate reason, that I feel like if I'm talking about Russia's history, I've got to kind of give it its own due, because it's such a rich and interesting history that I feel like if I skim over it at such a surface level, I'm doing it a disservice and I'm not talking about the important parts. And of course, there's lots of very useful and interesting things to know about its history that inform its current situation. And you really need to know this to understand the culture and the politics of modernity. So I'd like to start off by showing you where it is in the world. As you can see, it's in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm sure everyone, even Americans, can point to Russia on a map. So I'm sorry, that's really cheap and unfair. But yeah, you can see it's up there in the Northern Hemisphere, known for being cold, of course. It's actually the largest country in the world and twice the size of the second largest country, which is Canada. And I think, obviously, modern maps distort the shape of countries because of how, well, it's obviously a globe made flat, and therefore things have to be lost in how it's done. But you still get a sense of scale even in this kind of map.
Is it called the Mercator projection or something like this? I didn't know we'd be talking
so,
about
yeah.
maps, but I think it gives makes the northern hemisphere look bigger than it really is, a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I think
Africa's a lot
way
larger.
bigger than it appears, yeah, and South America and Australia. I think Australia, as big as it is even bigger in reality. But anyway, there's no question that Russia's the biggest in terms of area, is there?
Absolutely, yeah. So if we can move on to the elevation map, we can see that, here we go, most of the elevation is in the east. There's lots of more flat land towards the more European side. Obviously, we can see as well that Russia borders places like China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, which of course fell under
even
the
North
Soviet
Korea.
Union.
Have you noticed
Yes,
that? I always find that's funny. Whenever I remember or are reminded for whatever reason, it's actually got a land border with North Korea. You think, oh yeah, it's weird. And so close to Japan as well, right? I mean,
I know. Well, they've historically not been the best of friends, of course, as I'm sure you know.
We'll get into it.
And of course, particularly poignant at the minute is the fact that they border Ukraine in Europe. Of course, things kicking off there at the minute. And something I have forgotten to mention, actually, which I should have mentioned at the start, is that this is going out on Christmas Day. So hope you have a lovely
Merry Christmas.
Christmas as well.
To one and all.
I hope you're not sat in your room on Christmas Day watching this. Spend time with your family, please. Although this is going to be interesting, so I wouldn't blame you. But,
or maybe the whole family sitting around a PC or a laptop listening to us.
Nothing will fill you full of Christmas cheer like Russian history.
Right, yeah.
Some of the most depressing stuff about humanity you could possibly hear.
So that stuff down by Mongolia and China, I mean, that would be the Himalayan Plateau, right?
Yes.
Right.
And I think this acts as kind of like a big barrier to a lot of the cold air that blows down. But I'm going to get onto the climate side of things. Okay. So it's got the longest river in Europe on, obviously, the European side of Russia, which is the Volga, as you can see that on the kind of far western side. Supposedly its source is between Moscow and St. Petersburg and ends in the Caspian Sea, 2,194 miles away, which is about 3,531 kilometres. So it is ridiculously long as well. So that gives you a sense of scale, and Russia's scale is something that I'm going to keep on coming back to.
Because of course, Volga, there's the city of Volgograd on the Volga, isn't there? Which is Stalingrad. It's the same place.
I didn't realise.
They renamed it.
I know that the Soviets liked renaming stuff because, of course, St. Petersburg became Petrograd, which just means city of Peter, doesn't it?
Yeah. St. Petersburg.
So they removed
Petrograd.
the religious connotation of the name.
And Leningrad. It was also called Leningrad. So it's the same place, yeah. Anyway.
So there's also the largest lake, which is Lake Ladoga, which is near St. Petersburg. You can kind of see it there on the map a little bit. It's kind of close to the border with Finland, which historically Russia has not got along with well either. There'll be a running theme of that throughout a lot of the history.
That might be during the siege of Leningrad in World War II, there was this frozen lake that they were able to, the Germans could never completely surround Leningrad. There's this frozen lake that they could get some supplies back into. I wonder if it's that one. I think it is.
Yeah, but it's
6,700
square miles, this lake, so it is absurdly large. I mean, it's difficult to comprehend. It's basically a small sea at that point, I think, which is 17,600 square kilometres, and it is 136 miles long, which to us in Britain is a lot. That's basically...
So is it bigger than Wales? It's bigger than all of England? No, it's not bigger than that, but it's huge anyway.
Yes, it's
giant.
Difficult for us British people to understand because our tiny island seems rather big in and of itself, and this lake is basically... I mean, if we were to put Britain on it, it would kind of basically take a lion's share of the land, wouldn't it? But if we move on to the satellite map, we can see a little bit more how it's still similar to the terrain, but you can see just how flat some of the area closer to the steppe land is, and lots of grasslands and things like that. And actually this is where a lot of the population is. I think a significant portion of Russia's population is more towards the European side, of course, more towards
massively, right? Isn't most of the east, it's just tundra?
More or less. Well, it's kind of Siberian taiga at best, if not almost a wasteland. Like it's a bit grim. Obviously, Russia has a history of sending its exiles to Siberia, which is basically a passive death sentence, really, because it's so harsh there that it would be difficult to survive.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about how on the on the western side, how sort of relatively flat and verdant it is. It makes me think again of World War II when the Germans are invading through Belarus and Ukraine and then into Russia proper, that they said it was like an ocean of land. You know, when you're on the ocean and in every direction, it's ocean all the way to the horizon, 360. They say it was like that, but with sort of flat grasslands.
Yeah, I think that's
you can see, can't you? Can imagine that would be the case.
Yeah, and it's also quite swampy as well in many places, which I'll get onto in a second. But the capital of Moscow has a population of 11.92 million, making it larger than London, out of an entire population of 144 million as of 2020. So in all of that space, it's got a smaller population than America by about half, right? So
yeah, I do sometimes think that when you look at, say, on Wikipedia or something or other, and you look at lists of biggest countries, most population, and sort of literacy rates, and all sorts of things, and I do often think when you look at Russia that its population is relatively small. I mean, 140 million is loads. It dwarfs most countries in the world, but for what it is, it's relatively small, don't you think?
Well, yeah, of course. And I mean, I'm going to touch on the historic population changes when I talk about the history, because there's Basically, there's, I don't know how to put it, there's so many tragedies, famines, wars, that there's a constant corrective, if I can put it like that, on the population. Like there's a very hard ceiling on how much the population can grow. And that just comes from Russia's difficult history, I suppose, because it's not like there wasn't large population growth. It's just that there have been lots of factors that have seen lots of population decline as well, which didn't happen as much in, say, Western Europe, for example. So if we go to the climate map, we can see the different kinds of climates here. And this is interesting because you get a measure of just how kind of almost Arctic and cold it can be. So there's very little in the way. As you can see, most of it is somewhat wintry, subarctic. And in terms of latitude, you can expect some parts of Russia to be warm, but because of the way the winds operate, they have northerly winds that blow some of the cold air further south. So the latitudinal differences in temperature actually are more averaged together. So things that are further south in terms of latitude are actually not as cold. And to illustrate this, along the Mongolian border in the far south, the average temperature is only a degree or two above that of the Arctic coast, some 1,500 miles further north. So that's pretty significant. And that's part of the reason why Russia is so cold. So, for example, the January average temperature in St. Petersburg is -8 degrees Celsius. So this is, to most people, relatively cold, unless you're Scandinavian or Canadian, in which case you're probably, it's like, oh, that's not too bad, you'll be all right. But, for example, you can get -27 degrees Celsius at Turkhansk in western Siberia, which equates to -17 Fahrenheit, which I've never really understood Fahrenheit, so I'm just going to read these out. And then you've got temperatures that are just ridiculous. At Yakutsk, it can get to -43 degrees Celsius or -46 Fahrenheit, which is absurd. That's the kind of cold where if you're out in it for too long, you are going to die very quickly in the matter of perhaps minutes. And then there's also Verkhoyansk, which I'm definitely butchering the pronunciation of, which can get up to -50. So the point I'm trying to make here is it gets very cold. I think that's no mystery to anyone, but the extent to which kind of surprised me. And something that is very interesting is, for example, Vladivostok, which of course is on the far eastern side of Russia, it's the same latitude as the French Riviera, and yet has a mean average temperature in January of -14 degrees Celsius or 7 Fahrenheit.
That's funny, isn't it? It shows you how powerful the Gulf Stream is that hits northwestern Europe. Because again, in Britain, we're on the same latitude as like Alaska or something, I think.
It's certainly Canada.
It's close up there. So it's only the Gulf Stream that keeps us warm, or keeps us sort of, prevents us from being sort of sub-Arctic or something. It's funny, Turkhansk should be mentioned, because that was one of the places that Stalin was sent in exile as a punishment. And it's not even, in the scale of things, it's not even that cold, is it? I mean,
well, considering he grew up in Georgia, which is obviously a lot warmer. I mean, they grow grapes and they're famous for their wines. So compared to that kind of Caucasus temperature, going to Siberia must have still been quite a shock.
It's funny though, I like watching videos like survival type videos. I was watching some Canadian guy and he was out doing some camping in the Canadian wilderness and he said, it's only -8 or -10. It's not that cold today. Well, but even for guys like that, -58, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, you've got minutes to live.
Yeah,
unless you're wearing sort of full gear.
I've been camping in like the early winter in Britain, and it's maybe got to -1 or 2 at night, just below freezing, and it's basically insufferable. I had all the winter, the gear, but just breathing was painful. I mean, I basically had to just curl up into a ball in a sleeping bag to avoid the cold, and that's what, at least sometimes 50 degrees warmer than Russia.
Yeah.
So it's unfathomable.
I mean,
And
that's
think
actually colder than a freezer, right?
by a
commercial
significant margin.
Right.
And
Stupid.
actually, the world's lowest minimum January temperature outside of the Antarctica has been recorded. It's from Oymyakon in the northeast, where a temperature of minus 96 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 71 Celsius was recorded, which is just absurd. Like, it's not surprising that very few people live there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've done a thing, I've read about and researched a fair bit about Antarctic exploration and stuff, and it does get a little colder than that, but not much.
Yeah.
I mean, that's among the coldest places on Earth that it will ever be, that you'll ever get. I mean, there's the high Antarctic Plateau, but yeah, other than that, I mean, it's crazy. I saw a video the other day, a guy out in, what was the extreme eastern city you mentioned a minute
Vladivostok.
ago? Yeah, in Vladivostok, in a block of flats there. And he throws a big pot of water off the balcony, and it's that thing when it immediately turns into just a cloud of snow or a cloud of ice or something.
I've been able to do that in Britain, to be
really?
fair, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it's actually easier if you have hot water as well. I think it's because that there's more energy in it. I don't know. I'm no physicist. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments. So obviously there's lots of tundra in Siberia because it's difficult for vegetation, trees to grow. But obviously you also get, your coniferous forests and things like that. There should be a nice picture which shows you what those look like. There we go. A nice cabin in the background there. Lots of lovely trees. It looks quite idyllic. Nice. That's nice and Christmassy. That's going to be my one link to Christmas. Just that nice image. It's going to be the last nice one you're going to see.
And they call it the taiga, right? The Great Siberian
taiga, yeah.
It's taiga, is it pronounced?
I think so.
Okay.
It might be. That's how I've heard it pronounced. I might be hearing it wrong. It's as you can tell, I'm not the best at pronouncing things. Further south, you get your kind of boreal forests, and then further south still, you have your proper deciduous forests, which are quite often, as you go, mixed with the coniferous forests, like the one you can see here. So, of course, you also have steppe lands, which extend from around Ukrainian border to places like Kazakhstan. And you also have, as we have on screen here, the largest swamp in the Northern Hemisphere, which is Vasayuga swamp, located in southwestern Siberia. And this is one of those places where there's lots of pockets of water, but there's also permafrost locked in hills and things like that, which doesn't melt all year round. So it's a swamp, but it's also still got some ice in it. And this swamp is absolutely massive. As you can see from the image, it's panning off into the distance in and of itself. So it's unfathomably large. So in terms of the population of modern Russia, it's comprised more than 4/5 of the country's population is supposedly ethnically Russian, but of course, because of the nature of how large the country is, that it's got lots of surrounding regions with lots of different cultures. So there are 120 ethnic groups in total in Russia, which is massive. So I'm going to mention the ones which have more than 1 million members each, which are the Tatars, Ukrainians, the Shovash, the Bashkir, the Chechens, and the Armenians, which are all regarded as their own ethnic groups, which number more than 1 million. So there's quite a diverse array of people in Russia. Of course, they also border places like China and Mongolia as well, which are worth mentioning too. So now you get a bit of a picture of what the country is like in modernity, and kind of a bit more of a measure of the climate, the land itself, what the people are now. I think it'd be useful to go through some of the history, and this is going to be quite extensive. And obviously, Given the time that I've got, I'm not going to be able to give as detailed a history as I would like, but I'm going to do the best with the time that I do have. And the history is part of the reason why I've split it up into two parts, because it does need some focus on it, because it's very interesting and important, and there's a lot to be learnt from this, I think. So the early ancestors of what we could call the modern ethnic Russians were thought to have come in a couple of migrations from the Pinsk marshes, which is the largest wetland in Europe, which occupies kind of the southernmost part of Belarus and northwest of Ukraine. So they didn't actually form like a formal state. It was just a migration of Slavic peoples, I suppose, from this area to Russia, just to live in small rural villages, I suppose, and they didn't really feel the need to organise a state. And I think these kind of informal, ungoverned migrations starting Russia, I think, has tied a thread to ties to things like anarchism in Russia, because, for example, when you get to the 20th century, anarchists are a real thing, particularly
Right, yeah.
before the Bolsheviks take over, which I'll get onto, of course. But anarchism has roots in Russia. I mean, lots of famous anarchists are Russian. So unsurprising that the country was founded more or less by people who didn't even have a state. But the first formal state is widely regarded as the Kievan Rus, which lasted roughly between 882 AD to 1283. And this was formed by Vikings who mostly relied on piracy and trade, and it was just part of their expansion of their territory. Obviously, them being Scandinavian, of course, Vikings. If you were kind of Greek or Eastern, you might call them Varangians. I mean, the terms basically are interchangeable. So they expanded their territory to include the Eastern Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea. So basically parts of what we regard now as the Russian coast, more or less. And they mainly focused on protecting their trade routes. They weren't necessarily focused on expanding their territory to be as broad as modern-day Russia. They just wanted to focus on the Dnieper River, where there was a connection to the Byzantine Empire, which they protected to kind of protect the trade between both themselves and Scandinavia, which was relatively lucrative. So that's why they came in and set up the state as they did, because it was mostly due to financial considerations, really. They wanted to make sure the safety of the trade goods to maximise their profits, which...
It's interesting, the Varangian Guard is sort of a fairly well-known thing. But it's interesting just in the general sweep of things, how much the Scandinavian peoples reworked the map of the West, anyway, in the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, that aren't necessarily all that dark, but anyway. And the idea that the Rus are actually, not indigenous to that part of the world. They came from Scandinavia, basically, right?
Yeah, it seems like it, yeah.
And that they settled first and foremost in and around sort of Kiev, places like that, places that are nowadays in modern Belarus and Ukraine.
Yeah. So it kind of the Russian side of the border was more is more significantly based around Kiev, as you said, and it's more Ukraine, kind of more Eastern Europe rather than Russia proper, but it still encompassed some of Russia, especially as the Kievan Rus went on and they expanded their territory a bit. It went more into Russia, although there were other kingdoms, which I will get onto in a second. But this is the continuity of Russia, if you trace it back through history.
I think it's interesting, though, that you could make the argument, or people have said, I've heard people say that the Ukraine and Belarus are sort of more Russian than Russia, in a sense. That's sort of the original thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
And that when the again, to talk about World War II, when the Germans took Kiev in at the beginning of World War II, that was really, really profoundly a shock for the Soviets at that point. Like our in a sense, sort of a spiritual capital is Kiev is more than Moscow or St. Petersburg, and they couldn't quite believe that they'd sort of essentially lost Kiev. And then after the end of when Ukraine was recreated, I suppose, how it is sort of an embarrassment or a humiliation on some level for the Russians that this part of the world where Kiev is doesn't belong formally to the Kremlin anymore, and that it's like England losing a war and London, the whole southeast, say, being broken off and made into a new country. It would feel just wrong. It just okay.
No,
but you know what I mean. It would just feel wrong. It would feel like a slap in the face more than that, if anything.
It's damaging to national pride, isn't it?
Yes, that's a better way of putting it. But I'll leave it there because I know that's sort of probably stepping on the toes of the next one. But I just thought I'd want to mention that.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.